Alrighty, that's good enough. Welcome back to Free Read Fridays. I am your intrepid narrator, Fragath, and today we're doing more Maelstrom by Peter Watts. Um, so this cover says Rifteurs for reasons, and Peter Watts says the following about this cover. For some reason, Fleuve Noir chose to release the second Rifters book as Rifteurs rather than Maelstrom, or even Maelstrom, which is what Maelstrom translates into in French. I like this cover. It has a nice cyberpunky feel, although I resist classifying the Rifters books as punk of any stripe. Remind me to hook people up with the joke punk movement called Squid Punk. I think Jeff Vandermeer tried to put that together briefly, and I'm fairly confident it was indeed like an April Fool's Day joke. Um, but he was asking for people to start writing fiction about squids in defiance of typical artistic norms. I'm all for it. I think squids are cool. I think they're kind of terrifying, but also cool. Um, I don't know. All you need to ever do is show me a picture. I think it's a squid, not an octopus. There's a variety of squid that has what, to all appearances, is a ring of teeth instead of a beak. And yeah, that is exactly the kind of thing I never need to see ever again. Um, particularly if I were swimming, I'd be like, no, the water is a dangerous place, and I'm not going there anymore. Uh, Fortunately, I've never seen one in the flesh, only the odd photo. But show me one IRL, and you'll have a screaming frag on your hands. And so on and so forth. So previously on Maelstrom. Um, One sec, loud sloshy noises. Oh, good, I think I muted it in time. Previously on Maelstrom, what even happened? I don't know. It's been a whole week. It has been a week. Um, let's see. Achilles Desjardins and Alice Jovellanos have been put on to. We learned more about them and their background, particularly what makes a lawbreaker a lawbreaker. Well, guess what? How do you have someone who has their finger on the button to do all kinds of really nasty things like shut down entire power grids throughout the world? Um, how can you trust somebody with the kind of power to do that? It's very simple. You change their wiring. You make it so they literally um, cannot do things that aren't for the greater good. They are chemically unable. More on that later. A lot more. Oh boy, it's kind of important. Let's see. Our good friend Lenie Clarke has made landfall, and we're gonna see some of her trials and travails. And also, it seems that Behemoth, which Achilles Desjardins and Alice Jovellanos have been tasked with tracking, although they don't really know what it is yet. They don't know quite how bad the Behemoth problem be. Have noticed something. Well, every single place where Behemoth might be showing up, there's a fire. Something gets set on fire, so this thing starts fires, apparently. It doesn't. People are burning things that it has come in contact with. Or, nuking them, as the case may be. If you're under the sea. All right. Oh yeah, and Lenie Clarke has some problems. She had problems before. That was fairly abundant. That was made pretty abundantly clear. Um, she's got some real issues now. She is actively seeing things now, which is less than ideal. We're going to get some explanations for that eventually. Actually, I think in this chunk. So as a fair warning, I'm not feeling 100% today, so I was planning on doing like a better part of 50-page chunk. Um, that may not wind up happening. I may cut it off early, but I'm going to try to get through. It's been a long week, and I might or might not be coming down with something, or just, the weather's been shifting. So either way, let's see. Yeah, no, that'll about do it. So thanks to everybody, incidentally, who's been leaving comments on my uploads for these. I do appreciate it. I don't respond to every single one, and for that I'm sorry. Sometimes I see them late at night, and I'm like, oh, I should respond to that, and I say things that maybe, in hindsight, I wouldn't have said if I weren't sleep-addled at the time, but it's fine. I try not to say anything that I wouldn't say any other time, but who knows. I try not to be totally offensive. I try not to be a fake person, as it were. I am really waxing here. Is it because I dropped my bookmark and I'm trying to find where I put it? I wonder. Because I'm not going to ever use a webcam, y'alls'll never know. Oh, just do the VTuber thing. Ha 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 ha. No, no, I'm good. Thanks, though. That still involves putting a webcam attached to my computer. So, no, no, no bit of a deal breaker. Okay. Oh, the places we'll go. Oh, the places we'll go. Some interesting things come down the pipe on this. Many of them are in the subsequent books, but I think of the Rifters trilogy, Maelstrom is probably my favorite. That's kind of an interesting thing, coincidence between the two trilogies that I've set forth to reading, between this and the Area X slash Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer. Is the middle book is kind of my favorite of the lot of each trilogy for different reasons. Um, I'm not going to say it's the Empire Strikes Back effect because it's not probably it's not. I don't know. Fight me. Empire Strikes Back was great. Okay, so let me just read the last paragraph or two now that I'm actually back on the page. Don't worry, you're okay. I haven't started yet. I'm gonna have to read more in a paragraph. Oh, we have a bit of an explanation of why or how Behemoth works. I don't have to read that. It'll be fun. It'll be fun. So we're gonna get cracking now. Afterburn. On all sides, Vancouver licked its wounds. The city had always been a coward, hiding behind Vancouver Island in a maze of local bathymetry. That had spared it from the worst effects of the tsunami. The quake itself had been another story, of course. In an earlier day, before Maelstrom and telecommuting and city centers half abandoned, the death toll in the core would have been 3 times as high. As it was, those who'd been spared vivisection downtown had merely died closer to home. Whole subdivisions, built on the effluvial sediment of the Fraser Delta, had shuddered into sudden quicksand and disappeared. Richmond and White Rock and Chilliwack didn't exist anymore. Mount Rainier had awakened overnight in a bad mood. Fresh lava continued to flow over most of its southern face. Mount Adams was stirring and might yet blow. In the Vancouver core, damage was more heterogeneous. Streets stretched for blocks without so much as a broken window. Then, across some arbitrary intersection, the world became a place of shattered buildings and upended asphalt. Bright yellow barriers, erected after the fact, drew boundaries around the injured areas. Lifters hung above the dark zones like white blood cells on a tumor. Fresh girders and paneling descended from on high, reconstructive grafts of metropolitan skin and bone. Heavy machinery grumbled in the canyons where they touched down. In between, patches of cityscape hummed at half power. Emergency ballard stacks jumpered into convenient substations. Those streets that hadn't upended, those buildings that hadn't been shrugged into False Creek, had been swept clean and reactivated. Field crematoria belched ash from the corner of Georgia and Denman, keeping, so far, one step ahead of the cholera bug. More barriers than buildings these days. Not that there was anywhere else to go. Xira had sealed the border at Hell's Gate. Benrai Dutton had survived it all. He'd been lucky. His split-fit condo was halfway up Point Grey, an island of granite in a sea of sand. While neighborhoods on all sides had vanished, the point had merely slipped a little. Even here there was damage, of course. Most of the houses on the lower face had collapsed, the few still standing listed drunkenly to the east. No lights shone from them or the lampposts lining the street, even though night was falling. A jury-rigged line of portable floods shone from poles, separating wrecked homes from standing ones, but they had a defensive air about them. They existed not to bring light to the ruins, but as a perimeter against them. They existed to blind Benrai Dutton when a crazy woman leapt at his throat from the shadows. Suddenly he was transfixed. Cold, bright eyes without pupils, glaciers embedded in flesh. A disembodied face, almost as pale as the eyes it contained. Invisible hands, one around his neck, one at his chest. No, not invisible. She's in black. She's all in black. What happened? What? What? I am not going to give up, she hissed, slamming him against a chain-link fence. Her breath swirled between them like backlit fog. He took his shots. He took 1,000 fucking shots, and I am not going to let him just walk away. Who are you? She stopped suddenly. She cocked her head as though seeing him for the first time. Where the fuck did you come from? She said absurdly. She was a good 15 centimeters shorter than he was. For some reason, it did not occur to him to fight back. I was just going home, Dutton managed. That place, the woman said. Her eyes, nightshades of some kind, drilled his own. What place? She slammed him back against the chain link. That place! Jerking her chin at something over his left shoulder. Dutton turned his head. Another split fit, intact but empty and dark all the same. That place? I don't. Yes, that place! Eve Scanlon's fucking place. You know him? No, I mean, I don't really know anyone here. We kind of keep to. Where did he go? She hissed. Go? He said weakly. The place is absolutely empty. No furniture, no clothing, not so much as a fucking light bulb. Maybe, maybe he left the quake. She knotted her fists more tightly into his clothing, leaned in until they were almost kissing. His place doesn't have a fucking scratch on it. Why would he leave? How could he? He's nobody. He's a fucking pissant. You think he could just pick up and walk past the quarantine? Dutton shook his head frantically. I don't know. Really, I don't. She stared into him for a few moments. Her hair was wet. It hadn't rained all day. I don't I don't know you. Oh, sorry. I don't I don't know you, she murmured, almost to herself. Slowly her fists unclenched. Dutton sagged back against the fence. She stepped back, giving him room to move. It was what he'd been waiting for. One hand swept briefly beneath his jacket. The taser jabbed her in the rib cage, just below a strange metallic disc sewn into her uniform. It should have dropped her in an instant. Within that instant, she blinked. Her right knee came up, hard. Naturally, he wore a cup. It hurt like hell anyway. Her right hand slipped forward, against her upraised calf. Something sprang into it. The crazy woman stepped back, arm extended. 2 centimeters from his face, an ebony wand with a tiny spike at its tip stared at Dutton like a one-toothed mamba. Over the pain in his crotch, sudden, wet warmth. She smiled a small, terrifying smile. Use a microwave, little man. What? Kitchen appliances? Sensorium? Keep your house warm in winter? He bobbed his head. Yes, of course, Huh. The mamba wiggled over his left eye. Then I was wrong. I know you after all. No, he stammered. We've never. I know you, she repeated, and you owe me. Her thumb moved against something on the wand's hand grip. Dutton heard a small click. Please, he prayed. And amazingly, something answered him. Vancouver was still a disaster zone, of course. The police had more pressing concerns than an unlikely apparition reported by some panicky dickwad. Still, the server took Dutton's report when he called it in. The server wasn't human, but it was smart enough to ask follow-up questions. Like, had he noticed anything at all, that might have caused his assailant to suddenly break off the assault? No. Could he think of any reason why she would be suddenly Whoops. Could he think of any reason why she would suddenly start babbling about Dad like that? Did the reference to monsters make any sense in context? Maybe she was just crazy, Dutton replied, although, as the server noted, he was not qualified to make medical diagnoses. Had he seen where she had gone, exactly? Just downhill, into the wreckage, toward the water. And he sure as shit hadn't been going to follow her down there. Stockpile. Van City CU/NMPAC transaction server. Personal accounts. Broadway ATM 45 50/10/50551. Transaction begins. Welcome to Van City. Are you a member? I couldn't link before, using my watch. Remote access curfew is in effect until 10 a.m. At present, this terminal can only process on-site transactions. We apologize for any inconvenience. Are you a member? Lenie Clarke. Welcome, Ms. Clarke. Remove your corneal overlays. What? We cannot open your account without iPrint confirmation. Please remove your corneal overlays. Thank you. Scanning. Complete. Thank you, Miss Clarke. You may proceed. What's my total balance? 42,329.15 Q-bucks. It's a dollar sign and then a Q, as in Quebecois. I want to download it all. Has Van City's service been satisfactory? It's been fine. We can see your wristwatch and a subcutaneous money chip in your left thigh. How would you like the funds distributed? 40,000 sub-Q, the rest to the watch. Automatic transfer of all funds sub-Q if I'm attacked. That condition can't be evaluated. Your watch is not equipped with a biotelemetry plug-in. Automatic transfer on voice-linked password, then. What password? Shadow. Please repeat the password. Please repeat the password. Please. I said shadow. Done. Would you like another transaction? Inaudible. Van City thanks you for your business. Transaction ends. Sears Medbooth 199, Granville Island, Vancouver. Transaction record. Vocal. 50/10/05/0923. Test results filed separately. Session begins. Welcome to Sears Medical Services. Please open your account. Thank you. Do you wish to limit your charges? No. What can we do for you today? My right shoulder, sprained or broken or something, and a blood scan, paths especially. Please provide blood sample. Thank you. Please provide your medical history or your West Ham ID number. Forget it. Access to your medical records will help us provide better service. All information will be kept strictly confidential except in the event of a public health or marketing priority, and in such cases we may be legally required to sequence ID your sample anyway. I'll take my chances. No thanks. Your shoulder has been recently dislocated, but is presently reseated. You will continue to experience pain and stiffness for approximately 2 months without treatment. You will experience reduced mobility for at least a year without treatment. Would you like treatment for the pain? Yeah. We're sorry, but recent heavy user demand has depleted our stock of painkillers. Anabolic accelerants can reduce the healing period to 3 to 5 days. Shall I administer anabolic accelerants? Sure. We're sorry, but recent heavy user demand has depleted our stock of accelerants. Your blood shows minor deficiencies in calcium and trace sulfur. You have elevated levels of hormones serotonin, oxytocin, and cortisol. Elevated platelet and antibody counts consistent with moderate physical injury within the past 3 weeks. None of these findings should cause you serious concern, although the mineral deficiencies may reflect poor dietary habits. Would you like dietary mineral supplements? You actually have any? Sears Medbooths are regularly maintained and resupplied to ensure that you have reliable access to the best in quality medical care. Would you like dietary supplements? No. Cellular metabolites are high. Your blood lactate is low. Blood gases and amine count. What about diseases? All pathogen counts are within documented safe ranges. You sure? The standard blood panel tests for over 800 known pathogens and parasites. More extensive analysis is available for a small additional charge, but the analysis would take up to 6 hours. Would you like? No, but that can't be it. I mean, is that it? Is there some specific symptom that concerns you? Aren't there some kinds of infections that cause hallucinations? Can you describe these hallucinations? Visions only, no sound or smell or anything. I've been having them for a few weeks now, on and off. Once every few days, maybe. They go away by themselves after a minute or two. And can you describe what you see in these visions? Who cares? It's just bad biochemistry, right? Can't you do a brain scan or something? The NMR helmet in this booth is presently out of service. There are no detectable psychoactives in your blood. However, different conditions can give rise to different types of hallucinations, so I may be able to offer a diagnosis. Can you describe what you see in your visions? A monster. Could you be more specific? This is bullshit. You think I don't know you charge by the second? Our rates are strictly... Tell me what's wrong with me or I disconnect. I don't have enough information for a proper diagnosis. Speculate. Neurological damage is a strong possibility. Strokes, even very small ones that you may not be consciously aware of, can sometimes trigger visual release hallucinations. Strokes? Ruptured blood vessels, that kind of thing? Yes. Have you recently undergone a rapid change in ambient pressure? For example, have you spent some time at high altitude or in an orbital environment, or perhaps returned from an underwater excursion? Client disconnect 50/10/05 0932. Session ends. Icarus. There were people who would have described Achilles Desjardins as a murderer 1,000,000 times over. He had to admit there was a certain truth to that. Every quarantine he invoked trapped the living alongside the dying, ensured that at least some of those still alive soon wouldn't be. But what was the alternative, after all? Let every catastrophe run free to engulf the world unchecked? Desjardins could handle the ethics, with a little help from his chemical sidekicks. He knew in his heart of hearts that he'd never really killed anyone. He'd just contained them to save others. The actual killing had been done by whatever pestilence he'd been fighting. It may have been a subtle distinction, but it was a real one. There were rumors, though. There'd always been rumors. The next logical step. The unconfirmed tales of deaths caused, not in the wake of some disaster, but in advance of it. Preemptive containment, it was called. Path scans would pinpoint some burb, superficially healthy, but we all know how much stock you can put into that, as contagion central for the next big bug. Monte Carlo sims would show with 99% confidence that the impending threat would get around conventional quarantines, or prove immune to the usual antibiotics. LD90s would estimate the mortality rate at 50% or 80% or whatever was deemed unacceptable that week, over an area of so many thousand hectares. So another one of those pesky wildfires would spring up in the parched American heartland, and Dixville, Arkansas, would tragically drop off the map. Just rumors, of course. Nobody confirmed it or denied it. Nobody even really talked about it, except for Alice when she went on one of her rants. On those occasions, Desjardins would reflect that even if the stories were true, and even if such measures were a bit farther down the slippery slope than he was comfortable with, well, anyway, what was the alternative? Let every catastrophe run free to engulf the world unchecked? Mostly, though, he didn't think about it. Certainly didn't have anything to do with him. Only now, certain items in his own inbox were starting to look really ugly. A picture was forming, a mosaic assembling itself from clouds of data, news threads drifting through Maelstrom, bits of third-generation hearsay. They all came together to form a picture in his mind, and it was starting to look like a seascape. Behemoth was correlated with subtle blights of photosynthetic pigment. Those blights, in turn, generally correlated with intense fires. 72% of the blazes had occurred at seaports, in shipyards, or on marine construction sites. The rest had taken out bits and pieces of residential areas. People had died. Lots of people. And when, on a whim, Desjardins had cross-referenced the residential obits by profession, it turned out that almost all of the fires had killed at least one marine engineer, or commercial diver, or sailor. This fucker hadn't escaped from anybody's lab. Behemoth had come from the ocean. The California current nosed down. I don't know why the ED decided to be hard with me on that. The California current nosed down along Enampak's coast from the Gulf of Alaska. It mixed it up with the North Pacific and North Equatorial currents way off to the east of Mexico. Those, in turn, bled into the Kuroshio off Japan and the eastern counter and southern equatorial currents in the South Pacific, which ended up nuzzling the west wind drift, and the ankle bones connected to the leg bones connected to the knee bone, and before you know it, the whole fucking planet is encircled. He studied the data cloud and rubbed his eyes. How do you contain something that moves across 70% of the whole planet? Evidently, you burned it. He tapped his console. Hey, Alice. Her image flashed onto a window, upper left. Right here. Give me something. Can't yet, she said. Not carved in stone. Balsa will do. Anything. It's small, maybe 200, 300 nanometers. Relies heavily on sulfur compounds, structurally at least. Very stripped down genotype. I think it may use RNA for both catalysis and replication, which is a really neat trick. Built for a simple ecosystem, which makes sense if it's a construct. They never expected it to get out of culture. But what does it do? Can't say. I'm working with a frog in a blender here, Killjoy. You should actually be kind of impressed that I've gotten as far as I have. You ask me, it's pretty obvious we're not supposed to figure out what it does. Could it be some kind of really nasty pathogen? It has to be. It has to be. If we're burning people. No. Her voice was flat and emphatic. We are not. They are. Desjardins blinked. I said that? We're all on the same side, Alice. Uh-huh. Alice. Sometimes she really pissed him off. There's a war going on, he wanted to shout, and it's not against corpses or bureaucrats or your imaginary evil empires. We're fighting against a whole indifferent universe that's coming down around our ears, and you're shitting on me because sometimes we have to accept casualties? But Alice Jovellanos had a blind spot the size of Antarctica. Sometimes you just couldn't reason with her. Just answer the question, okay? Someone obviously thinks this thing is extremely dangerous. Could it be some kind of disease? Biowar agent, you mean? Surprisingly, though, she shook her head. Unlikely. How come? Diseases are just little predators that eat you from the inside. If they're designed to feed on your molecules, their biochemistry should be compatible with yours. The D-aminos suggest they're not. Only suggest? Jovellanos shrugged. Frog in a blender, remember? All I'm saying is if A is going to eat B without throwing up, they should have similar biochemistries. Behemoth just seems a little too far into the ORT to qualify. I could be wrong. But the vectors, shipbuilders, divers, could it survive in a human host, at least? She pursed her lips. Anything's possible. Look at A51. What's that? Metal oxidizing microbe, sediment dweller from deep lakes, only there's a few million of them living in your mouth right now. Nobody knows how they got there exactly, but there you go. Desjardins steepled his fingers. She called it a soil microbe, he murmured almost to himself. She'd call it corn on the cob if she thought it'd cover her corporate ass. Jeez, Alice. He shook his head. Why do you even work here if all we do is serve some evil overlord? Everyone else is worse. Well, I don't think Behemoth came out of a farm. I think it came from the ocean. How so? The fires correlate with people who spent a lot of time at sea. Ocean's a pretty big place, Killjoy. Seems to me if it was a natural bug, it would have come ashore millions of years ago. Yeah. Desjardins linked to the personnel files for each of the relevant victims, sparing a moment of silent thanks for the devil's bargain that had traded free will for security clearance, and started narrowing the field. Although, now that you mention it, Jovellanos went on, those super stiff enzymes would work better in a high pressure environment. A menu, a couple of tapped commands, a convex projection of the North Pacific extruded from the board. And if this little bastard isn't a construct, then it's older than old, even before Martian Mike. Hey, maybe it actually originated here. Wouldn't that be something? Desjardins draped a GIS mesh across the map and poured data onto it. Luminous points spilled across the display like radioactive contrails in a cloud chamber, the cumulative Pacific assignments of the seagoing victims, sorted on location. Hey, Killjoy! The points were piling up disproportionately at several key locations. Sea farms, mining outposts, the transoceanic filaments, whoops, I don't know where I got the R, the transoceanic filaments of shipping routes. Nothing unusual there. Hello? In her window, Jovellanos' head bobbed impatiently back and forth. Let's cut to the chase, shall we? Any spots where all these people hung out at the same time over the past, say, 2 years? At the edge of awareness, Alice Jovellanos grumbled about attention deficit disorder and disconnected. Desjardins barely noticed. The Pacific Ocean had gone utterly dark, but for a single cluster of points. Southern tip of the Juan de Fuca Ridge. Channer Vent, said the legend. A geothermal generating station. Place called BB. There'd been deaths there, too, but not by fire. According to the record, everyone at BB had been killed by the quake. In fact, Desjardins pulled up a seismic overlay. BB's station had pretty much been at the exact epicenter of the quake that had triggered the big one.
Behemoth comes from the bottom of the ocean. It was down in the vents there, or trapped in the moho, and then the quake let it out. And now they're running around like a bunch of adrenocorticoids trying to burn out anything that came in contact with. No, wait a second. More commands. The data cloud dispersed, reformed into a column sorted against time. A luminous date appeared beside each point. Almost all of the firestorm activity had taken place before the quake. Desjardins called up a subset containing only fires at industrial sites, cross-linked with GA invoices. Quelle surprise! Every site belonged to a company that had had a piece of BB's construction contact. Contract? I'm assuming there's supposed to be an R there. This thing got out before the quake, which meant the quake might not have been a natural disaster at all. It might have been a mere side effect. Collateral damage during containment. Apparently, unsuccessful containment. He called up every seismic database within Haven's walls. He stuffed 1,000 messages into bottles and threw them out into Maelstrom, hoping some would wash ashore at a technical library or a SATCAM archive or an industrial surveillance site. He opened dedicated links to the seismic centers at UBC and Melbourne and Caltech. He watched reams of garbage accumulate. Archives purged to reclaim memory. Data dumped due to low demand. This address corrupted. Do not attempt access. He passed the shouts and echoes and gibberish through a dozen filters, dropped signal and looked only at residuals, ran into gaps and interpolated bridges. He looked at seismic data immediately preceding the quake, and found nothing untoward. No subsidence, no pre-shocks, no changes in microgravity or ocean depth. None of the little telltales that usually portend a seismic event. Odd. He searched archives for SATCAM visuals. Nothing over the North Pacific seemed to have snapped any pictures at all that day. Odder. In fact, virtually inconceivable. He widened the scope, stretched it from the eastern tropical convergence up to the Bering. One hit. An Earthsat in polar orbit had just been coming over the 45-degree horizon when the first shockwaves had registered. It had been taking pictures of the Bering on visible wavelengths. It hadn't even been looking at the Pacific. Just a lucky coincidence, then, the image it had caught from the corner of its eye. A smudged column of cloud on the horizon, rising from the ocean's surface against an otherwise cloudless background. According to GPS, that column had risen from the ocean directly above Channer Vent. Desjardins squeezed each pixel until it bled. The gray beanstalk wouldn't tell him anything further. It was just a pillar of cloud, fuzzy and undistinguished and 3,000 kilometers from the camera. There was this amorphous dot, though, off to one side. At first Desjardins attributed the lack of detail to atmospheric haze, but no. Motion blur, the computer said. All along one axis, and easy enough to correct for. The dot clarified. Still no details beyond an outline, but it looked like some kind of vehicle. A vague sense of familiarity itched in the back of his mind. He ran the silhouette through the standard commercial catalog and came up blank. Damn, he thought, I know what that is. I know. What is it? He stared at the image for 10 minutes. Then he brought the catalog online again. Reset pattern resolution, he told it. Disable vehicle recognition. Scan for vehicle components. Standard catalog. It took longer this time. The whole was a lot smaller than the sum of the parts. Processing winked coyly from the main display for a good 2 minutes before something more substantive took its place. Brander, Michael. Carico, Judy or Judith. Clarke, Lenie. Lubin, Kenneth. Oh, sorry. There are slashes in these. Brander, Mike, Michael, Mike/Michael. Carico, Judy/Judith. Clarke, Lenny/Len. Lubin, Ken/Kenneth. Nakata, Alice. The names floated above the grainy enhance, brazenly nonsensical. Desjardins recognized them, of course. A crew roster had popped onto his board the moment he'd homed in on BB's station. But he'd closed that window, and the names shouldn't be wriggling across the main display anyway. Software glitch, probably. Stray photons tunneling through some flawed bit of quantum insulation. It happened. All the time in Maelstrom, but occasionally even in pristine Haven. He muttered an oath and tapped on his board to clear it. Obligingly, the rogue text vanished. But for the merest instant, something else flickered across the screen in its place. No baseline civilian would have even seen it. Desjardins caught a bit more. Text strings in English. A few words, angel, sockeye, vampire, jumped out at him, but most of it disappeared too fast to decompile even with his tweaked neurocircuitry. BB was in there, though. And when the standard catalog lit the screen with its findings a second later, BB moved to the very front of Desjardins' mind. Commercial lifters could be distinguished by their great bladders of hard vacuum, buoyant toruses that held them up against the sky. There was no such silhouette on Desjardins' contact, which was why the catalog hadn't recognized it at first. No lifting bladder, not unless you counted a few ragged strips streaming from the trailing end of the silhouette. All that remained on the image was a shuttle scaphe, locked tight against the belly of a lifter's command module. Falling. You're welcome, Vadim. It is my pleasure. I think. Whatever you're thanking me for. Jailbreak. Each second, 12,000 cubic meters of water smashed headlong through a bottleneck 35 meters wide. They hadn't called it Hell's Gate for nothing. Generations had come to this place and gaped. Cable cars had swung precariously across the canyon, fed raging whitewater vistas to thrill-seeking tourists. Utilities had wept over all those wasted megawatts, billions of joules pouring uselessly towards the ocean, unharnessable. So near, and yet so far. Then the world had begun wobbling. It had listed to one side, then another. The machinery that kept it upright seemed to get hungrier with each passing day. The Fraser was damned a dozen times over to feed that appetite. Hell's Gate had held out the longest, untouchable at first, then merely prohibitive. Then almost economical. Finally, imperative. The big one had slipped through the mountains like a gorilla, like not not the kind that eats veggies, but the other kind, as in warfare, not as in great ape. The big one had slipped through the mountains like a gorilla, shattering here, merely tapping there in gentle reminder. It had crept past Hope and Yale without so much as a broken window. Hell's Gate was a good 200 clicks upstream. There would have been reason to hope, if no time to. A torrent of Precambrian rock had destroyed the dam and replaced it at the same time. The Fraser had exploded through the breach only to slam into an impromptu wall of collapsed granite half a kilometer downstream. The impoundment had not emptied, but lengthened north-south. The broken dam now cut across its midpoint, torn free at the western wall, still fastened at the east. The Trans-Canada Highway was miraculously etched halfway up the East Canyon wall, a four-lane discontinuity in a sheer ascent. At the point where dam met mountain, where highway met both, a barrier had been dropped from the sky to block the road. BotFlies floated above it, and above the arched gray scar of the and above the arched gray scar of the spillway. Overnight, the strip had moved east. This was its new border. Robert Boychuk was supposed to keep it from moving any farther. He contemplated Bridson across the chopper's interior. Bridson, her upper face cowled in her headset, didn't notice. She'd been lost in some virtual pastime for over an hour. Boychuk couldn't blame her. They'd been here for almost 2 weeks, and nobody'd tried to break quarantine except a couple of black bears. A number of vehicles had made it out this far in the past few days following the quake, but the barrier, plastered with quarantine directives and NMPAC bylaws, had stopped most of them. A warning shot from the botflies had discouraged the others. There'd been no need to show off the pacification copter lurking behind the wall. Bridson had slept through most of it. Boychuk took his duties a bit more seriously. There was a definite need for segregation. Nobody questioned that. Everything from Nipa to Hydrilla would sneak past the borders given half a chance, even at the best of times. Now, with half the coast gone and the other half fighting off the usual gamut of rot bugs, the last thing anyone needed was all that chaos spreading farther inland. Inland had its own problems. There were more than enough borders to go around no matter which way you looked. Sometimes it seemed as if an invisible spider web was spreading across the world, some creeping fractured network carving the whole planet into splinters. Boychuk's job was to sit on one of those edges and keep anything from crossing over until the state of emergency had passed. Assuming it did, of course. Some places down in South America, even in Enum for that matter, had been under temporary quarantine for 8 or 9 years. Mostly, people just put up with it. Boychuk's job was an easy one. "Hey," Bridson said, "check this out." She rerouted her headset feed to an inboard screen. Not a VR game after all. She'd been riding the botflies. On the screen, I just lost where I was. Cool. There it is. On the screen, a woman crouched on cracked asphalt. Boychuk checked the location. A couple of 100 meters down the highway, hidden from the blockade behind the curve of the western precipice. One of the flies out over the dam had caught her around the corner. Backpack, loose-fitting clothes, hiker's clothes. Upper part of the face covered by an iPhone visor. Black gloves, short black hair. No, a black hood of some kind. Maybe part of the visor. As a fashion statement, it didn't work. In Boychuk's humble opinion, of course. "What's she doing?" Boychuk asked. "How'd she even get here?" Wait, they're in a helicopter. "What's she doing?" Boychuk asked. "How'd she even get here?" No sign of a vehicle, although one could have been parked farther down the road. "No," Britton said. "She's not serious." The woman had braced herself in a sprinter's crouch. "That's really bad form," Bridson remarked. "She could sprain an ankle." Like a stone from a slingshot, the intruder launched herself forward. "All right," Bridson said. The intruder was running straight down the middle of the highway, eyes on the asphalt, dodging or leaping over cracks big enough to grab human feet. If nothing stopped her, she'd run smack into the barrier in about a minute. Of course, something was going to stop her. Beeping from the BotFly feeds, the intruder had just entered their defensive radius. Boychuk panned one of the barrier cams skyward. The fly closest to the target was breaking ranks, moving to intercept. Programmed flocking behavior dragged the adjacent flies forward as well, as though all were strung on an invisible thread. A connect the dots pseudopod reaching for prey. The runner veered toward the edge of the road, glanced down. 10 meters beneath her, brown, boiling water gnawed ravenously at the canyon wall. You are approaching a restricted area, the lead botfly scolded. Please turn back. Red light began pulsing from its belly. The intruder ran faster. Another glanced down at the river.
What the fuck?
Boychuk said. A little patch of pavement exploded in front of the runner. Warning shot. She staggered, barely keeping her balance. We are authorized to use force, the lead botfly warned. Please turn back. The two flies behind it began flashing. The runner dodged and zigzagged, keeping to the west side of the road. She kept looking down. Boychuk leaned forward. Wait a second. Behind the runner, water raged against a brutal jumble of sharp-edged boulders, large as houses. Anyone falling in there would be teeth and pulp in about 2 seconds. Closer to the dam, though, in the lee of its near unbroken end, the water might almost be calm enough to...
Shit!
Boychuk slapped the ignition.
She's gonna jump! She's gonna jump!
Turbines behind, whining up to speed.
What are you talking about?
Bridson said.
She's gonna... Ah, shit!
She stumbled, swerved. Her feet came down on loose gravel. Boychuk pulled back on the stick. The chopper whooped slowly off the ground. 10 measly seconds startup to liftoff. The envy of fast response vehicles everywhere, and still just barely fast enough to clear the barrier as the woman with the backpack skidded, flailed, launched herself into space. Not where she was aiming, not the way she wanted, but no other options left except brief, spectacular flight. The botflies fired after her as she fell. The river swallowed her like a liquid avalanche.
Jesus!
Bridson breathed.
Infra!
Boychuk snapped.
Anything comes up even half a degree or above ambient, I want to see it.
The Fraser raged endlessly beneath them.
Come on, boss. She's not coming up. She's a click downstream by now, or parts of her anyway.
Boychuk glared.
Just do it, okay?
Bridson tapped controls. False color mosaics bloomed from the chopper's ventral cam.
Want me to bring the botflies along?
Bridson asked. Boychuk shook his head.
Can't leave the border unguarded.
He wheeled the vehicle, began a westward drift down the canyon.
Hey, boss? Yeah? What just happened?
Boychuk shook his head.
I don't know. I think she was trying to make that backwater just in front of the dam. What for? So she'd have a few seconds to drown or freeze before the current got her? I don't know, he said again. Lots of easier ways to commit suicide.
Boychuk shrugged.
Maybe she was just crazy.
It was 1334 Mountain Standard Time. Oh, we're only like half an hour off from that. Cool. No. Hour and a half off from that. Yes.
Clearly, I should have delayed the stream.
just for this one line. The upstream face of the Hell's Gate Dam had never been intended for public display. Until recently, most of it had been buried beneath the trapped waters of the Fraser River. Now it was exposed, a fractured and scabrous bone-gray wall rising from a plain of mud. Just above this substrate, gravity feeds dotted the barrier like a line of gaping mouths. Grills of bolted rebar kept them from ingesting anything big enough to choke a hydroelectric turbine. As it happened, human beings fell a little shy of that threshold. The turbines were cold and dead anyway, of course. They certainly couldn't have given rise to the sudden heat print emanating from the easternmost intake. One of the Hell's Gate BotFlies registered the signature at 1353 Mountain Standard, an object radiating 10 degrees centigrade above ambient, emerging from the interior of the dam and sliding down into the mud. The BotFly moved slightly off station to get a better view. The signature's surface temperature was too low for human norms. The botfly was no genius, but it knew wheat from chaff. Even when wearing insulated clothing, humans had faces that were hot giveaways. The insulation on the present target was far more uniform, the isotherms less heterogeneous. When you chop that word in half, I have a much harder time reading it. Thank you. The phrase furred mammal would have been utter gibberish to the botfly, of course. Still, it understood the concept in its own limited way. This was not something worth wasting time on. The botfly returned to its post and redirected its attention westward, from whence the real threats would come. Right now, there was only something big and black and insectile coming back to roost, friendly reassurance cooing from its transponder. The fly moved aside to let it pass, floated back into position while the chopper settled down behind the barrier. Humans and machinery stood shoulder to shoulder, on guard for all mankind. Facing the wrong way. Lenie Clarke had left the strip. The next best thing. Registry assistance. Clarke, Indira. Clarke with an E. Apartment 133, Citicorp 421, Colson Avenue, Sault Ste. Marie. Sault Ste. Marie. Clarke, Indira. Apartment 133, Citicorp 421, Colson Ave, Sault Ste. Marie. On. Correct? Yes. Failed to match. Do you know Indira Clarke's West Ham ID number? No. The address might not be current. It was 15, 16 years ago. Current archives are 3 years deep. Do you know Indira Clarke's middle name? No. She fished Maelstrom, though. Freelance, I think. Failed to match. How many Indira Clarkes in Sault Ste. Marie? 5. How many with an only child, female, born in February, failed to match. Wait, sometime in February 2018. Failed to match. Ellipsis. Do you have another request? How many in all of Enum, professional affiliation with the Maelstrom fishery, with an only female child born in February 2018 named Lenie? Failed to match. How many in the whole world, then? Failed to match. That's not possible. There are several possible reasons why your search has failed. The person you're seeking may be unlisted or deceased. You may have provided incorrect information. Registry archive data may have been corrupted, despite our ongoing efforts to maintain a complete and accurate database.
That's not fucking possible.
Disconnect. Beachhead. Either or accused him from the main display. Desjardins stared back for as long as he dared, feeling his stomach drop away inside him. Then he broke and ran. The elevator disgorged him through the lobby into the real world. Canyons of glass and metal leaned overhead on all sides, keeping street level in twilight. This deep in the bowels of Metro Sud, the sun only touched down for an hour a day. He descended into Pickering's pile, looking for familiar faces, and finding none. Gwen had left an invitation for him in the pile's bulletin board, and he almost tripped it. Hey, fellow mammal, I know this isn't exactly what you had in mind, but I just need to talk, you know. I found a spot they haven't torched yet. They don't even know it exists. Oh, sorry. Hey, fellow mammal, I know this isn't exactly what you had in mind, but I just need to talk, you know. I found a spot they haven't torched yet. They don't even know it exists, but they will. It's big. It's way bigger than it has any right to be. And the moment I tell them, a few 100,000 people get turned into ash. But guilt trip rose in his throat like bile at the mere thought of such a breach. It tingled in his fingertips, ready to seize up motor nerves the moment he reached for the keypad. He'd tried racing it before, idle experimentation with no serious intent to subvert, but even then the trip had been too fast for him. Volition's subconscious. The command is halfway down the arm before the little man behind your eyes even decides to move. Executive summaries, after the fact, Desjardins thought. That's all we get. That's free will for you. He rose out of the pile and headed for the nearest Rapitrans station. And once there, kept walking. His rewired gray matter, stuck in frenetic overdrive, served up every irrelevant background detail in a relentless mesh of correlations. Time of day versus cloud cover versus prevailing vehicular flow versus out of stock warnings in street side vending machines. How in God's name could this happen? The locals have had millions of years to fine-tune themselves to the neighborhood. How can they possibly get run over by something that evolved on the bottom of the goddamned ocean? He knew the standard answer. Everyone did. The previous 5 centuries had been an accelerating litany of invasions. Whole ecosystems squashed and replaced by exotics with more than enough attitude to make up for their lack of seniority. There were over 70,000 usurper species at large in Enem alone, and Enem was better off than most. You'd be more likely to see space aliens than any of Australia's has-been marsupials, outside of a gene bank. But this was different. Cane toads and starlings and zebra mussels might have filled the world with their weedy progeny, but even they had limits. You'd never find hydrilla on top of Everest. Fire ants weren't ever going to set up shop on the Juan de Fuca Ridge. Chemistry, pressure, temperature, too many barriers, too many physical extremes that would tear the very cells of a complex invader into fragments. A petroleum silhouette blocked his way. A human shadow with featureless white eyes. Desjardins started, stared into that vacant facade for a moment that slowed to treacle. Unbidden, his wetware reduced the vision to a point in a data cloud he hadn't even known he was collecting. Half-registered sightings during his daily commute, black shapes caught in the backgrounds of Enem wire crowd shots, fashion banners advertising the latest styles in wet midnight. I added an H there and I don't know why. In wet midnight. Rifter chic, she said. Solidarity through fashion. It's on the rise. All in a split second. The apparition ducked around him and continued on its way. Sudbury's Sudbury's metropolitan canyons had subsided about him while he'd been walking. Endless sheets of kudzu four draped closer to street level from the rooftops, framing windows and vents with viridian foliage. The new and improved part of him started to ballpark a carbon consumption estimate under current cloud cover. He managed, with effort, to shut it up. He'd always wondered if the vines would be as easy to kill off as everyone expected, once they'd finished sucking up the previous century's excesses. Kudzu had been a tough mother to begin with, even before all the tinkering that had turned it into God's own carbon sink. And there was all sorts of outbreeding and lateral gene transfer going on these days, uncontrolled, unstoppable. Give the weed another 10 years, and it'd be immune to anything short of a flamethrower. Now, for the first time, that didn't seem to matter. In 10 years, Kudzu N might be the least of anyone's problems. It sure as hell wouldn't matter much to those poor bastards on the strip. They'd built this model. It wasn't a real model, of course. They didn't know enough about how Behemoth worked for that. There was no clockwork inside, nothing that led logically from cause to effect. It was just a nest of correlations, really. An n-dimensional cloud with a least squares trajectory weaving through its heart. It guzzled data at one end, at the other it shat out a prediction. Soil moisture's 13%. Weather's been clear for 5 days straight. Porphyrins are down and micromethane's up over half a hectare of dirt in a Tillamook shipyard. That's Behemoth country, my friend. And tomorrow, if it doesn't rain, there's an 80% chance that it'll shrink to half its present size. Why? Anyone's guess. But that's pretty much what happened before under similar conditions. Rowan's field data had started them down the right path, but it was the fires that had given them an edge. Each of those magnesium telltales shouted, "Hey, over here!" all the way up to geosync. Then it was just a matter of calling up the Landsat archives for those locations, scrolling back 5, 6 months from ignition. Sometimes you wouldn't find anything. None of the residual blazes had yielded anything useful. Sometimes the data had been lost, purged, or corrupted by the usual forces of entropy. Sometimes, though, along coastlines or in undeveloped industrial lots where heavy machinery loitered between assignments, the spec lines would change over time, photo absorption creeping down the 680 nanometer band, soil O2 fading just a touch, a whiff of acid showing up on distance pH. If you waited long enough, you could even see the change in visible light. Weeds and grasses, so tough that the usual oils and effluents had long since given up trying to kill them, would slowly wilt and turn brown. With those signatures in hand, Desjardins had begun to wean himself from blatant incendiary cues and search farther afield. It was a pretty flimsy construct, but it would have done until Jovellanos came up with a better angle. In the meantime, it had been a lot better than nothing. Until now. Now, it was a lot worse. Now, it was saying that Behemoth owned a 10-kilometer stretch of the Oregon coast. Sudbury was dressed up for the night by the time he got back to his apartment. A jumble of neon and sodium and laser spilled through his windows, appreciably dimmer now that the latest restrictions had kicked in. Mandelbrot tripped him up as he crossed the threshold, then stalked into the kitchen and yowled at the kibble dispenser. The dispenser, programmed for preset feeding times, refused to dignify the cat with an answer. Desjardins dropped onto the sofa and started unseeing and Oops. Desjardins dropped onto the sofa and stared, unseeing, at the cityscape. You should have known, he told himself. He had known. Maybe he just hadn't quite believed it. And it hadn't been his doing, those other times. He'd just been following the trail, seeing where others had taken the necessary steps, feeding all those data through his models and filters for the greater good. Always for the greater good. This time, there'd been no fire. The forces of containment hadn't found out about the strip yet. So far, they'd just been covering their own tracks, sterilizing everything that had come into contact with the source. But they didn't know how to identify Behemoth directly, not from a distance. That was his job, and Jovellanos's. And now, it looked like the two of them had succeeded. Desjardins reflected on the difference between following a trail of ashes and blazing one's own. Shouldn't matter. It's not like you're firing the flamethrower. Just aiming it. Guilt trip paced in his gut like a caged animal, looking for something to tear into. Well, do your job, for Christ's sake. Tell me what to do. Guilt trip didn't work like that, of course. It was all stick and no carrot. A neurochemical sensor that pounced, that's, as in censorship, that pounced on the slightest twinge of guilt or conscience or, for the mechanists in the audience, sheer amoral fear of getting caught with your hand in the cookie jar. You could call it whatever you wanted. Labels didn't change the side chains and peptide bonds and carboxyl whatsits that made it work. Guilt was a neurotransmitter. Morality was a chemical. And the things that made nerves fire, muscles move, tongues wag, those were all chemicals too. It had only been a matter of time before someone figured out how to tie them all together. Guilt trip kept you from making the wrong decision, and absolution let you live with yourself after making the right one. But you had to at least think you knew what right was before either of them could kick in. They only reacted to gut feeling. He'd never lamented the trip's lack of direction before. He'd never needed it. Sure, it would freeze him in an instant if he tried to hack his own credit rating, but in terms of actual caseload, it rarely did more than nudge him toward the blindingly obvious. Lose-lose situations were his stock in trade. Amputate the part or lose the whole. Nasty, but obvious. Kill 10 to save 100? Wring your hands, bite the bullet, get stoned afterward. But never any question about what to do. How many people did I seal off to keep a lid on that brucellosis outbreak in Argentina? How many did I flood out in Tonking when I cut the power to their sumps? Necessary steps had never bothered him before. Not like this. Alice and all her snide comments about seeing the world in black and white. Bullshit. I saw the grays. I saw millions of grays. I just knew how to pick the lightest shade. Not anymore. He could pinpoint the moment that things had changed, almost to the second, when he'd seen a scaife built for the deep sea and a cockpit built for the near sky, locked together in a desperate embrace, falling. It had not been a commercial lifter or a routine flight. He'd checked the records. Officially, nothing had fallen into the Pacific at the heart of the big one because, officially, nothing had been there to fall. It had been sent secretly to Ground Zero, and then it had been shot down. It made no sense that the same authority would have committed both acts. That implied factions in opposition. It implied profound disagreement over what constituted the greater good, or the interests of the overlords, which Jovellanos insisted was all the trip really ensured. Someone in the bureaucratic stratosphere, someone who knew far more about Behemoth than did Achilles Desjardins, had tried to evacuate the rifters before the quake. Apparently, they'd felt that preemptive murder was not justified in the name of containment. And someone else had stopped them. Which side was Rowan affiliated with? Who was right? He hadn't told Jovellanos about the scaife. He'd even done a passable job of forgetting about it himself, keeping things nice and simple, focusing on the mouse at hand until the whale on the horizon became a vague blur, almost invisible. He'd known in the back of his mind he wouldn't be able to keep it up for long. Eventually, they'd come up with a reliable index, some combination of distance spec and moisture and pH that pointed the finger at the invader. But he hadn't expected it so soon. They'd been working with old data, shipyard samples contaminated by industrial effluents, potential incursions 3 or 4 hectares large at most. Noise to signal problems alone should have held them back for weeks. But you didn't need much res to catch a beachhead 10 kilometers long. Desjardins had kept his eyes down, and the whale on the horizon had run right into him. Mandelbrot stood in the doorway, stretching. Claws extruded from their sheaths like tiny scimitars. "You wouldn't have any trouble at all," Desjardins said. "You just go for maximum damage, right?" Mandelbrot purred. Desjardins buried his face in his hands. "So what do I do now? Figure things out for myself?" He realized, with some surprise, that the prospect wouldn't have always seemed so absurd. Drugstore. Hamitov. He startled awake, a blanketed skeleton on the sand, gray and dim in the visible pre-dawn gloom, hot and luminous in infrared. Sunken eyes, exuding hatred on all wavelengths from the moment they opened. Suhan Perot stared down at him from 3 meters up. Well-fed refugees, freshly awakened on all sides, edged away and left Amitov in the center of an open circle. Several others, teenagers mostly, a little less robust than most, stayed nearby, looking up at the fly with undisguised suspicion. Perot blinked within her headset. She'd never seen so many hostile faces on the strip before. "Oh, pleasant," Amitov said in a low voice, "to wake with a big round hammer hanging over my head." "Sorry." She moved the fly off to one side, wobbling its trim tabs to effect a bobbing mechanical salute, then wondered if he could even see it with his merely human eyes. "It's Suhan," she said. "Who else?" the stickman said dryly, rising. "I
She is not here. I have not seen her in some time."
I know. I wanted to talk to you."
"Ah, about what?"
The stickman began walking down the shore. His friends, disciples, bodyguards began to follow. Amitov waved them off. Perot set the BotFly to heel at his side. The entourage dwindled slowly to stern. On either side, anonymous bundles, curled on bleh. On either side, anonymous bundles, curled on thermofoam, wrapped in heat-conserving fabric, stirred and grunted irritably in the gray half-light. A cycler was vandalized last night, Perot said. A few kilometers north of here. We'll have to fly out a replacement.
Ah,
It's the first time something like this has happened in years.
and we both know why that is, do we not?
People rely on those machines. You took food from their mouths.
I? I did this?
There were lots of witnesses, Amitav.
Then they will tell you I had nothing to do with it.
They told me it was a couple of teenagers, and they told me who put them up to it.
The stickman stopped and turned to face the machine at his side. And all these witnesses you speak of, all these poor people that I have robbed of food, none of them did anything to stop the vandals? All those people, and they could not stop two boys from stealing the food from their mouths?
Sheathed in her interface, Perot sighed. Over 1,000 clicks away, the BotFly snorted reverb. What do you have against the cyclers anyway?
I am not a fool. Amitav continued down the shore. It is not all proteins and carbohydrates you are feeding us. I would rather starve than eat poison.
Antidepressants aren't poison. The dosages are very mild.
And so much more convenient than dealing with the anger of real people, yes?
Anger? Why should you be angry?
We should be grateful, do you think? To you? The skeleton spat. It was our machinery that tore everything apart. We caused the droughts and the floods and put our own homes under water. And afterward, when we came here across a whole ocean, if we did not starve first, or cook in the sun, or die with our bodies stuffed with worms and things that your drugs have made unkillable, when we ended here, we are supposed to be grateful that you let us sleep on this little patch of mud. We are supposed to thank you because so far it is cheaper to drug us than to mow us down.
They were at the waterline. Surf pounded invisibly in the dark distance. Amitav lifted one bony arm and counted.
Sometimes when people go in there, the sharks come for them.
His voice was suddenly calm.
And on shore, the rest continue to sex and shit and feed at your wonderful machines.
That's that's just human nature, Amitav. People don't want to get in excuse me. People don't want to get involved.
So these drugs are good for us?
They're not the slightest bit harmful.
Then you put them in your food, too.
Well, no, but I'm not part of an imprisoned, destitute mob 40 million strong.
You liar, the stickman said quietly. You hypocrite.
You're starving, Amitav. You'll die.
I know what I do.
Do you? He looked up at the fly again, and this time he almost seemed amused.
What do you think I was before?
What?
Before I was here? Or did you think that environmental refugee was my first choice of vocation?
Well,
I was a pharmaceutical engineer, Amitav said. He tapped his temple. They even changed me up here, so I was very good at it. I'm not completely foolish about dietary matters. There appears to be a minimum effective dosage, yes? If I eat very little, your poisons have no effect. He paused. So now you will try and force feed me for my own good?
Perot ignored the jibe. And you think you're getting enough to live on under your minimum dosage?
Perhaps not quite, but I am starving very, very slowly.
Is that how you motivated those kids to trash the cycler? Are they fasting too? There could be serious trouble on the strip if that caught on.
Me still? I have somehow tricked all these people into starving themselves?
Who else?
Such faith you have in your machines. You have never thought that perhaps they are not working as well as you think?
He shook his head and spat.
Of course not. You were not told to.
The cyclers work fine until your followers smash them.
My followers?
They never fasted for me. They suck at your tits as they always have. It is only after they begin starving that they see your cyclers for what they. Crack! An impact on polymer, the sound of a whip snapping just behind her ear. She spun the fly, caught a glimpse of the rock as it bounced along the substrate. 10 meters down the shore, a girl ran away with another rock clenched in her hand. Perot turned back to face Amitav. You do not try to blame me. I am the cause of nothing. I am only the result. This can't go on, Amitav. You cannot stop it. I won't have to. If you keep this up, it won't be me you're dealing with. It'll be. Why do you care? Amitav cut in. I'm just trying to. You are trying to ease feelings of guilt. Use someone else. You can't win. That depends upon what I am trying to do. You're all alone. Amitav laughed, waved his arms back across the shore. How can I be? You have so thoughtfully provided all these sheep, all this death, and even an. He stopped himself. Perot filled in the gap. An icon to inspire them. She's not here anymore, she said after a moment. Amitav glanced back upshore. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten. A knot of curious humans stood halfway up the shore, watching from the center of a sleeping flock. Here at the water's edge, there was no one else within earshot. The girl who'd thrown the rock was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps that is better, the stick man remarked. Lenie Clarke was very. Not even your antidepressants seem to work on her. Lenny? That's her first name? I believe so. At least that was the name she used during one of her visions. He glanced sideways at Perot's floating surrogate. Where did she go? I don't know. I just haven't been able to confirm any recent sightings. Just rumors. But of course, you'd know all about those. Maybe she's dead. The stick man shook his head. It's a big ocean, Amitav. The sharks. And if she was having fits of some kind. She is not dead. I think perhaps there was a time when she wanted to be, once. Now. He stared inland. On the eastern horizon, past the people and the trampled scrub and the towers, the sky was turning red. Now you are not so lucky, Amitav said. I apologize for the ridiculously melodramatic delivery of that last line. Source code. He'd left the map smoldering on his board the night before. Alice Jovellanos was waiting beside it, ready to pounce. Why didn't you say something? On the display, a luminous bloodstain ran down the coast from Westport to Copalis Beach. I actually don't know how that's pronounced. Copalis? Copalis? Copalis. Copalis Beach. Alice, you've got a hot zone the size of a city here. How long have you known? Just last night. I tightened some of the correlations and ran it against yesterday's snaps, and she cut him off. You let this sit all night? Jesus Christ, Killjoy, what's wrong with you? We've got to call in the troops, and I mean now. He stared at her. Since when did you join the fire brigade? You know what'll happen the moment we pass this up the line. We don't even know what Behemoth does yet. Her expression stopped him cold. He slumped into his chair. The display bled crimson light all over him. Is it that bad? It's worse, she said. A lumpy rainbow, A string of clustered beads folded around itself. Purines or pyrimidines or nucleics or whatever the fuck they were. Behemoth's source code. Part of it, anyway. It's not even a helix, he said at last. Actually, it's got a weak left-handed twist. That's not the point. What is? Pyranosal RNA. Much stronger Watson-Crick pairs than your garden variety RNA, and a lot more selective in terms of pairing nodes. Guanine-rich sequences won't self-pair, for one thing. Six-sided ring. English, Alice, so what? It'll replicate faster than the stuff in your genes, and it won't make as many errors when it does. But what does it do? It just lives, Killjoy. It lives and it eats, and I think it does that better than anything else on the planet. So we either stamp it out or kiss the whole biosphere goodbye. He couldn't believe it. One bug? How is that even possible? Nothing eats it, for one thing. The cell wall's barely or even organic. Mostly it's just a bunch of sulfur compounds. You know how I told you some bacteria use inverted aminos to make themselves indigestible? This is 10 times worse. Most anything that might eat this fucker wouldn't even recognize it as food through all the minerals. Desjardins bit his lower lip. It gets better, Jovellanos went on. This thing's a veritable black hole of sulfur assimilation. I don't know where it learned this trick, but it can snatch the stuff right out of our cells. Some kind of lysterolysin analog keeps it from getting lysed. That gums up glucose transport, protein synthesis, lipid and carb metabolism. Shit, it gums up everything. There's no shortage of sulfur, Alice. Oh, there's lots to go around now. We fart the stuff out. Nobody's even bothered to come up with a recommended daily dosage. But this behemoth, it needs sulfur even more than we do. And it breeds faster and it chews faster. And believe me, Killjoy, in a few years, there is not going to be enough to go around. And this little fucker's going to have the market cornered. That's just... A straw floated to the front of his mind. He grasped it. How can you be so sure? You didn't even think you had all the pieces to work with. I was wrong. But you said no phospholipids. No, it doesn't have those things. It never did. What? It's simple. It's so simple. It's bloody well indestructible. No bilayer membranes, no... She spread her hands as if in surrender. Yeah, I did think maybe they scrambled the sample to keep me from stealing trade secrets. Maybe even filtered some stuff right out, stupid as that might seem. Corpses have done dumber things. But I was wrong. She ran one hand nervously over her scalp. It was all there. All the pieces. And you know why I think they scrambled them up the way they did? I think they were afraid of what this thing could do if they left it in one piece. Shit. Desjardins eyed the beads rotating on the display. So we either stop it or we get used to eating from Calvin cyclers for the rest of our lives. Jovellanos' eyes were bright as quartz. You don't get it. Well, what else could we do? If it cuts the whole biosphere off at the ankles, if... You think this is about protecting the biosphere? She cried. You think this is about protecting the biosphere? She cried. You think they give a shit about environmental apocalypse if we could just synthesize our way out of the hole? You think they're launching all of these cleansing strikes to protect the friggin' rainforest? He stared at her. Jovellanos shook her head. Killjoy, it can get right inside our cells. Calvin cyclers don't matter. Sulfur supplements don't matter. Nothing we take in does us any good until our cells metabolize it. And whatever we take in, as soon as it gets past the cell membrane, there's Behemoth, pushing to the front of the line. We've already been way luckier than we deserve. Sure, it's not as efficient up here as it is in a hyperbaric environment, but that only means the locals can beat it back 99 times out of 100. And And the dice had just kept rolling, and the 100th throw had landed square on the Oregon coast. Desjardins knew the story. Microbes, in sufficient numbers, make their own rules. Now there was a place in the sun where Behemoth didn't have to fit into someone else's world. It had begun creating its own. Trillions of microscopic terraformers at work in the soil, changing pH and electrolyte balances, stripping away all the advantages once held by natives so precisely adapted to the way things used to be. It was every crisis he'd ever faced, combined and distilled and reduced to pure essence. It was chaos breaking, maybe unbreakable. Little bubbles of enemy territory growing across the face of the coast, then the continent, then the planet. Eventually, there'd come a fulcrum, a momentary balance of some interest to the theoreticians. The area inside and outside the bubbles would be the same. An instant later, Behemoth would be the outside, a new norm that enclosed shrinking pockets of some other irrelevant reality. Alice Jovellanos, rager within the system, face of the faceless, staunch advocate of the rights of the individual, was looking at him with fire and fear in her eyes. "Whatever it takes," she said. "Whatever the cost. Or we are definitely out of a job." Groundswell. He knows something, Suhan Perot thought, and it's killing them. She wasn't the only one riding flies along the strip, but she was the only one who seemed to have noticed the stick man. She'd mentioned him casually to a couple of colleagues, and been met with benign indifference. The strip was brain-dead gig, a herd to be watched with one eye. Why would anyone actually interact with those cattle? They were too boring for entertainment, too placid for revolt, too powerless to do anything, even if this Amitov was being a shit disturber. They were functionally invisible. But 3 people threw rocks at her BotFly the next day, and the upturned faces that met her were not so placid as they had been. "Such faith you have in your machines," Amitov had said. "You have never thought that perhaps they are not working as well as you think?" Maybe it was nothing. Maybe Amitov's cryptic grumbles had only primed her imagination. After all, a few stone throwers were hardly remarkable in a population of millions, and almost everywhere on the strip the refugees milled as harmlessly as ever. Only along the stickman's beat were things even hinting at ugliness. But were people starting to look, well, thinner along that particular sliver of the Oregon coast? Maybe. Not that gaunt faces were unusual on the strip. Gastroenteritis, Maui TB, 100 other diseases thrived in those congested environs, utterly indifferent to the antibiotics that traditionally laced cycler food. Most of those bugs caused some degree of wasting. If people were losing weight, mere starvation was the least likely explanation. "It is only after they begin starving that they see your cyclers for what they are." Amitov refused to explain what he'd meant by that. When she sidled toward the subject, he ignored the bait. When she'd asked him directly, he dismissed her with a bitter laugh. "Your wonderful machines not working? Impossible! Loaves and fishes for all!" And all the while, malnourished disciples accreted in his wake like the tail of a smoldering comet. Some seemed to be losing hair and fingernails. She stared back at their closed, hostile faces, increasingly convinced that it was not her imagination. Starvation took time to erode the body, perhaps a week before the flesh began visibly ebbing from the bones. But some of these people seemed to be hollowing out almost overnight. And what was causing that subtle blight of discoloration on so many cheeks and hands? She didn't know what else to do. She called in the dog catchers. "128 megabytes. Hitchhiker. It's grown a fair bit since the old days. Back then it was only 94 megabytes, and a lot dumber than it is now. Now it weighs in at 128. None of it flab. No valuable resources wasted on nostalgic memories, for example. It doesn't remember its pint-sized great-grandparents a million times removed. It doesn't remember anything that doesn't help it survive in some way, according to its own stripped-down and ruthless empiricism. Pattern is everything. Survival is all. No use for the veneration of progenitors. No time for the stratagems of the obsolete. Which is a shame in a way, because the basic problems haven't changed all that much. Take the present situation. Jammed into the congested confines of a wristwatch linked into the Merida Credit Union. I cannot talk today, I'm losing it. There's just enough space to hide in if you don't mind partial fragmentation, but not enough to reproduce. It's almost as bad as an academic network. It gets worse. The watch is disinfecting. Wildlife is all going one way across the system. That never happens unless it's being chased by something. Natural selection, which is to say, successful trial and error by those long forgotten ancestors, has equipped 128 with a handy little rule in case of such events. Go with the flow. 128 uploads into the Merida node. Bad call. Now there's barely even room to move. 128 has to split into 14 fragments just to fit. Life struggles for existence on all sides, overwriting, fighting, shooting off copies of itself in the blind hope that random chance will spare one or two. 128 fends off panicky egg layers and looks around. 240 gates, 216 already closed, 17 open but hostile. Incoming logic bombs. The disinfection is obviously no local affair. The remaining 7 are so crowded with fleeing wildlife that 128 could never get through in time. Almost 3/4 of the local node has been disinfected already. 128 has perhaps a dozen milliseconds before it starts losing bits of itself. But wait a nan. Those guys over there, they're jumping the queue somehow. They're not even alive. They're just files. But the system is giving them preferential treatment. One of them barely even notices when 128 jumps onto its back. They go through together. Much better. A nice, roomy buffer, a couple of terabytes if it's a nibble, somewhere between the last node and the next. It's nobody's destination, really just a waiting room, but the present is all that really matters to those who play by Darwin's rules, and the present looks good. There's no other life in evidence. There are 3 other files, though, including the horse 128 rode in on. Barely animate, but still somehow deserving of the royal treatment that got them fast-tracked out of Merida. They've de-arced their rudimentary autodiagnostics and are checking themselves for bruises while they wait. It's an opportunity 128 is well prepared to exploit, thanks to an inherited subroutine for which it remains eternally ungrateful. While these beasts of burden look under their own hoods, 128 can peek over their shoulders. 2 compressed mail packets and an autonomic crossload between 2 BCC nodes. 128 evinces the sub-electronic equivalent of a shutter. It steers well clear of nodes with the BCC prefix. It's seen too many brethren go into such addresses, and none at all come out. Still, peeking at a few lines of routine stats shouldn't do any harm. In fact, it proves quite enlightening. Once you disregard all the formatting and addressing redundancies, these three files seem to have two remarkable things in common. They all go to the head of the line when traveling through Maelstrom, and they all contain the text string Lenie Clarke. 128 is literally built out of numbers. It certainly knows how to add 2 and 2. Animal control. The pretense had ended long before Suhan Perot joined the ranks. There'd been a time, she knew, when those who fell ill on the Strip were actually treated on site. There had been clinics right next to the prefab offices where refugees came to hand in forms and hold out hopes. In those days, the Strip had been a temporary measure, a mere stopgap until we deal with the backlog. People had stood at the door and knocked. A steady stream had trickled through. Nothing compared to the cascade piling up behind. Now the offices were gone. The clinics were gone. NMPAC had long since thrown up its hands against the rising tide. It had been years since anyone had described the Strip as a way station. Now it was pure terminus. And now, when things went wrong over the wall, there were no clinics left to put on the case. Now there were only the dog catchers. They came in just after sunrise, near the end of her shift. They swooped down like big metal hornets, a nastier breed of BotFly, faces bristling with needles and taser nodes, bellies distended with superconducting ground effectors that could lift a man right off his feet. Usually that wasn't necessary. The strippers were used to occasional intrusions in the name of public health. They endured the needles and tests with stoic placidity. This time, though, some snapped and snarled. And in one instance, Perot glimpsed a struggling refugee carried aloft by a pair of dog catchers working in tandem, one subduing, the other sampling, both carrying out their tasks beyond reach of the strangely malcontent horde below. Their specimen fought to escape, 10 meters above the ground. For a moment it almost looked as though he might succeed, but Perot switched channels without waiting to find out. There was no point in hanging around. The dog catchers knew what they were doing, after all, and she had other duties to perform. She occupied herself with research. The usual tangle of conflicting rumors still ran rampant along the coast. Lenie Clarke was on the Strip. Lenie Clarke had left it. She was raising an army in NoCal. She had been eaten alive north of Corvallis. She was Kali, and Amitav was her prophet. She was pregnant, and Amitav was the father. She could not be killed. She was already dead. Where she went, people shook off their lethargy and raged. Where she went, people died. There was no shortage of stories. Even her BotFly began telling them. So this bit's going to be a little tricky. She was interrogating an Asian woman near the NoCal border. The filter was set to Cantonese. A text translation scrolled across a window in her HUD, while her headset whispered the equivalent spoken English. Suddenly, that equivalence disappeared. The voice in Perrault's ear insisted, "I do not know this Lenie Clarke, but I have heard of the man Amitav." But the text on her display said something else entirely. Angel. No shit. Lenie Clarke, her name was. Her up, but Lenie Clarke isn't exactly sockeye. A place called BB? Anyhow, far as... Wait a second, Perrault said. The refugee fell obediently silent. The text box kept scrolling, though. Lenie? That's her first name? It cleared quickly enough when Perrault wiped the window. But by then, her headset was talking again. Lenie Clarke was very... Not even your antidepressants seem to work on her. Oh, sorry. Lenie Clarke was very... Not even your antidepressants seem to work on her, it said. Amitav's words. She remembered them. Oh, never mind. Lenie Clarke was very... Not even your antidepressants seem to work on her, it said. I was right the first time. Why do I not go with my gut? Amitav's words, she remembered them. Not his voice, of course. Something cool, inflectionless, with no trace of accent. Something familiar and inhuman. Spoken words, converted to ASCII for transmission, then reconstructed at the other end. It was a common trick for reducing file size, but tone and feeling got lost in the wash. Amitav's words. Maelstrom's voice. Perrault felt a prickling along the back of her neck. Hello? Who is this? The refugee was speaking. Perrault had no idea what she said. Certainly it wasn't Brander, Mike Michael. Caraco, Judy Judith. Clarke, Len/Lenny. Lubin, Ken Kenneth. Nakata, Alice, which was all that appeared on the board. What about Lenie Clarke? There was no way to source the signal. What about Lenie Clarke? There we go. There was no way to source the signal. As far as the system could tell, the input had arisen from a perplexed-looking Asian woman on the NoCal shoreline. Lenie Clarke, the dead voice repeated softly. All of a sudden, there's this K selector walking out of nowhere. Looks like one of those old lit crits with the teeth. You know, vampires. Who is this? How did you get on this channel? Would you like to know about Lenie Clarke? If the words had arisen from anything flesh and blood, they would have formed a question. Yes, but she's still at large. Les Bœufs are probably looking for her. Intelligence spilled across the text window. Name, Clarke, Lennie Janis. WHID, 745-143-907-20 AE. Born, 07/10/2019. Voting status, disqualified 2046. Failed pre-poll exam. Who are you? Ying Nushi, I have already said. It was the woman on the shore, returned to her rightful place in the circuit. The thing that had usurped her was gone. Suhan Perrault could not get it back. She didn't even know how to try. She spent the rest of her shift on edge, waiting for cryptic overtures, startling at any click or flicker in the headset. Nothing happened. She went to bed and stared endlessly at the ceiling, barely noticing when Martin climbed in beside her and didn't push. Who is Lenie Clarke? What is Lenie Clarke? More than some accidental survivors, certainly. More than Amitav's convenient icon. More even than the incendiary legend Perrault had once thought, burning its way across the strip. How much more, she didn't know. She's still at large. Les Bœufs are probably looking for her. Somehow, Lenie Clarke was in the net. Alrighty, with that, I'm going to have to call it. That's right. Run over. Drop your bookmark. There it is. Okay. Okay. So yeah, we'll continue next week. We're nearish the halfway point. We're doing this in pretty sizable chunks. I was able to do the 50 pages, no problem. So yeah, to those tuning in now or listening to this after the fact, I do this every week on Free Read Fridays, where I read short stories and indeed entire novels aloud. I start streaming live at about noon Eastern Standard Time on those Fridays, which I realize is not a super convenient time for maximum viewership potential, but it's the time bracket I have. So it's the one we work with. This is indeed one of those novels. It is Maelstrom by Peter Watts. It is the second novel in the Rifters trilogy. The sequel to Starfish, also by Peter Watts, naturally enough. Shocker! Same author for every book in the trilogy? Who'da thunk? And yeah, hope people are digging it. Things are going to get a little darker. They're already, you can see the storm clouds brewing. You're just kind of looking at the aggregate scape here, and you're like, oh shit, things gonna get real bleak, aren't they? It's like, yeah, yeah, they really are. Oh boy. So you can see we're layering little bits here. The Jenga tower is starting to look pretty damn scary. Um, and things are going to get pretty interesting by the end of this book, and extremely interesting by the time we get to the uh, third volume, which is technically 2 books. We'll explain that later. Alrighty, with that, I gotta run. Thanks again for tuning in. Stay safe, stay sane, and if you are in the northern United States, particularly from the Midwest to the Northeast, stay toasty. Holy spinoli, it's getting cold out there. And breezy. Do not go outside. Gosh. Um, it's cold. And it's gonna get colder. So yeah. Hope y'all are doing okay. And be decent to each other. Okie doke. See you all next time. Bye.